Hi everyone. So welcome to our talk today. We've got Chris Jackson over for us this week. He's based in the NRC Biostatistics Unit at the University of Cambridge, and he's speaking to us today on a new tool, flexible and transparent explanation of extrapolate. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much, and thank you for welcoming me to Belfast. This is my first time over here, so I'll be talking to you about survival analysis today. I'll hopefully, I've got a lot of time. I'll try and take my time and explain things properly. But let's see how that goes. Okay, so I'll talk about survival analysis. So you will see a lot of this kind of graph during this talk. This is a survival curve where it's survival probability against time and estimated from data where people are followed up for some limited period, and the time of their events maybe censored at that period. The applied contexts I'm looking at are where a policymaker has to make some kind of decision on the basis of that data with limited follow-up. So a very common situation is in health technology assessment or health economic evaluations, where the health service has to decide whether a novel treatment should be adopted on the health service, given this limited data, which is most commonly from clinical trials that only have limited follow-up, say 3 years, 5 years. But I'm not working so much in that health economics area these days. These days, I'm part of a research program that is like public health, population health. And during the COVID pandemic, we were faced with data sets and situations where we wanted to look at kind of burden on hospitals during an epidemic. We had data on hospital stays that were right-censored survival data, time to event data. So the event is discharge from hospital or death. So we want to predict expected total length of stay in hospital for a population. And that's mathematically, that's the same problem. You've got to estimate some kind of long-term expectation based on this censored data. And the key thing here is that we have to make a decision because the consequences of that decision are going to last longer than the follow-up of the trial. We can't throw our hands up and say, we just haven't got the data. This short-term data is all you've got. You've got to make a decision on the basis. And the thing that the policymakers are most commonly interested in is the expectation or the mean survival. So mathematically, that's the area under the survival curve. So the restricted mean is the area until the end of follow-up. But what they're really interested in is the kind of the long-term mean up to a follow-up of infinity, essentially. So that's the expectation of the survival time. And that's, I said, and they're really interested in that because that's equivalent to knowing an expectation is equivalent to knowing a total. So the kind of total outcome over the population of interest. So conventionally, survival analysis is done using semi-parametric, non-parametric methods, which aim to just describe what the data say. And those cannot, on their own, estimate expected survival over the long term without building in your other tools. On the other hand, if you've got a fully parametric distribution describing that random time to the event, such as survival, hospital discharge, or whatever that event is, then you can summarize that distribution. You get the expectation of that distribution. That's the quantity we need for policymaking. So there are many ways of setting up a parametric survival model. And that's this part of the challenge, not the whole challenge, but it's the beginning of the challenge. So one of the commonest models people get taught here is the Weibel distribution. There's a 2-parameter model here with the shape and scale survival function on the left, and this is the idea of survival extrapolation. So people fit survival model, estimate those parameters from the short-term data, and then project that fitted model into the future, and then estimate whatever they want to estimate based on that extrapolated distribution. So the other kind of plot you will see a lot in the rest of the talk is the hazard function. So that's an intuitive way of representing how somebody's risk of an event changes over time. And under the Weibel distribution, you can have a decreasing hazard or an increasing hazard or a constant, as is the exponential But that's a limited. That gives you only a limited range of hazard shapes. There are other models. Many other models, many of the parametric models, for example, there's the log logistic distribution under which you can have a increasing and then a decreasing. So look at, and you see here on the left, you've got different extrapolations. So you will get different results under those two different models. So we have to decide how to weigh those up. And a very common practice, or it has been a very common practice in this area of survival extrapolation on parametric models, for people to, you launch your software package, and then you go through all the models that software gives you and see the results under each one. It's commonly Stata that this is done with, but sometimes R. But you've got a range of models that give you different results, and then you try and weigh those up somehow and see. So first thing you can compare is how well those models fit the data in the short term, which is fine if you're interested in the short term, but not if you're interested in long term, because it's short term fit is a rather poor guide to long term plausibility, accuracy, whether it is going to represent the true process that you're modeling. And so it's a more difficult thing to do to assess which one of these models is more plausible in long term. So I mean conventionally, this has always often done with kind of informal judgment about what people think will happen. But more generally, it's acknowledged that it's better to build in evidence or formally considered judgments about what will happen in that longer term. So where might that come from? So if you talk about long-term survival of people with a disease, then the basic thing you want to think of is how long do people live? I mean, you've got always got general population data on all-cause survival, and you might make assumptions like if you've got a specific disease, then your survival cannot be better than the general population. That's a common thing that people assume. You might have you might have data sets that describe people with the same disease as the trial of the treatment you're studying, or disease registries for cancer and many other diseases. So you might want to exploit the information in those data on survival on the longer term than the trials tell you. And you might want to build in kind of clinical judgments, such as I think that some people get cured. So in those cases, the risk of dying from that specific disease will reduce to zero at some point. You might want to maybe formally use expert elicitation to quantify judgments about long-term survival, and want to be able to use this kind of information in some kind of way that is statistically printable, but also kind of clear and transparent. So this is the methodological challenge, and actually, it's a challenge that to a large extent has been solved. I mean, there's many different methods of combining short-term individual survival data with longer-term external data. Many ways of doing this, and there's review papers over the years describing the state of the art. And there's this nice decision support unit. I've got some nice documents on advanced methods for survival analysis where some of these ideas have been discussed. So lots of different ways to do it. But on the other hand, if there's lots and lots of different ways to do it, which one should you do? And what should people who are coming into this area, what tool do they use? How do they kind of get an easy kind of grasp on this problem? So this is where I started thinking about what's really missing from this area as a single kind of general purpose tool and framework that will represent some kind of best practice. So when I was kind of planning this work, I was thinking about what would be the ideal characteristics of such a method or tool. So you would want to be able to incorporate multiple kinds of data of different forms, to be able to build in different sources, and to be able to represent that data as faithfully as possible, basically to fit the data, not just the short term, but represent how different data sources might vary from each other. And you want to be able to make whatever assumptions you're making clear and transparent so that decision makers know what you've done. You want, I think underappreciated thing is to be able to quantify uncertainty appropriately, so we know so we get an idea of what we don't know. We have an appreciation of maybe what data we might want to collect in the future to reduce uncertainty. But clearly, I mean, maybe not so obviously, but I think it's really important that the methods should be easily accessible as well as transparent and flexible. They should be the methods that people can use without having to tune or program in a complicated and involved kind of problem-specific way. So I'm looking at all of this literature, and so my kind of background in statistics is I've done a lot of work in Bayesian modeling and models for combining different sources of evidence. So I personally, I really like these kinds of methods because they can, they've got the flexibility. You can build models that fit not just one data set well, but multiple different sources and represent, quantitatively how different data sources are related to each other. So it's kind of a generalization of meta-analysis, if anyone's familiar with that area. And at the end, you get the evidence quantified. But the problem with these methods, they're complicated, and they have in this literature, the occasions when these methods have been used, they've needed specialized programming and specialized kind of statistical expertise. So there's bugs and jags software. Each new model, you have to write the problem-specific code and represent the data in a different way. So it's a big kind of barrier to entry. So the challenge I can set myself with this work is to build an easily usable tool that implements this method in as straightforward and transparent a way as possible. And so the rest of the talk, I'll explain what I came up with. And this is this package called survextrap. So there's a GitHub site, go to learn about this. And great good news that the paper's just been published last week in BMC Medical Research Methodology. So all of the details in here, and I'll do my best to make it clear what this package does and how it works in the rest of this talk. So it's doing Bayesian survival modeling, flexible Bayesian survival modeling, incorporating individual data with longer term aggregate data to enable extrapolations. It's based on a spline, which is a very flexible parametric model, and I'll tell you how that works. And it uses Markov chain Monte Carlo estimation using the STAN software as a computational engine inside this R. So it's an R package with you can just write one command to fit your model, but underneath the surface, it's calling this STAN software for MCMC estimation. So the kind of design principles behind it is the user specifies the data and specifies the assumptions they're making in as transparent a way as possible, but the assumptions that don't matter get kind of hidden away in a black box. And you can judge for yourselves how successful you think that is when you see the package. But there's some further work going on, as you'll see later. So I'll give you a rapid tour of its features. So to start with, the basic, simple survival model for one individual level survival data set. So the idea is to have a default model, the R command down at the bottom there, a default model that gets you a model that fits the data as well as might be expected. Survival curve there, and it also represents how that hazard curve, any kind of increases and decreases in the hazard over time. So these examples here are from a data set on head and neck cancer in this paper. You had a clinical trial with 5 years follow-up, but there was a decision-making context where they wanted to extrapolate that data using other sources of evidence, as you'll see. So I'll tell you in a minute how exactly this M-spline model works. So it's flexible within the data, and after the end, after some points, it will assume that the hazard is constant. So that's just with the individual level data. So what if you wanted to extrapolate in the long term using that data set? So the default, under the default model, and if you don't specify anything else, it will assume the hazard is constant, but that's not always realistic. You might want to allow for changes in risk in the long term. And suppose you might think that there might be hazard changes up to 20 years. So suppose you wanted to extrapolate up to 20 years. The basic assumption that the package makes is that the hazard is smooth. It's a smooth function of time, which is, I don't think that's a very strong assumption, but there's no assumption about whether it goes up or whether it goes down. And if there's no data, then it will just tell you, I don't know if the hazard is going to go up or down. And what you will get is a posterior distribution that represents that uncertainty that is a consequence of having no data. All you've assumed that the hazard function is smooth, but you don't know if it's going to increase or decrease. So those extrapolations are going to be influenced weakly by the latest data through the smoothness assumption. But in the longer term, you're ignorance because you've got no data. And so in the actual user interface, what you would specify here is add knots is equal to 20. I'll tell you what a knot is in a minute, but that's saying that the hazard can vary up to 20 years. So that's the idea of being fairly transparent. You've got your short-term data, and you've got an assumption that hazard might change, but you don't actually have data on how that hazard will change. Okay. Where are we now? Oh, right. So we're on to the maths and the technical stuff now. So I didn't have the time to explain this last time I did this talk, so I can go into the nuts and bolts, hopefully to give you a better idea of how this model actually works. So in a spline model, or you call it a basis function model, a flexible function is represented as a linear combination of simpler terms, which are known as basis functions. So in this case, these are cubic polynomials. So we've got a cubic spline, and the parameters of the model are the coefficients of these basis terms. And you've got this scale term eta at the end, so the hazard can be any size. So I'll show you a picture, which might hopefully make it clearer how this works. So in this model here, this example model, there are n equals 5 basis functions, and they're defined on what's called knots. So these knots are points in time where we essentially piece together these simpler functions to make a smooth function. And so this is the smooth function we built here. This is our hazard h of t, which is built up as a combination of those simpler functions. Okay, so these BIFT are defined in a kind of special way to ensure that the function that you end up with is smooth, so that it's continuous derivatives, I think, are not so, or something like that. But in this case, we've got the basis functions here are the grey lines. So each one is associated with a region of time. So you're taking an average. So this PI, it's weighted sum. You're taking a weighted sum of these things in each regions of time. So each of the PIs are related to kind of the level of the hazard in the corresponding period of time. So each one is B1, B2, B3, B4, B5, 5 basis functions, and we get, you've got higher coefficients for the second one here, the third one here gives you a higher hazard. So there's, depending on what the coefficients are, these PI, you get different shapes that represent different patterns of increase and decrease in disease risk over time. The maths, I will show the maths behind this, but there's special values of the PI that give you a constant hazard. So that's a important special case when building these models, is this constant hazard. Okay. So when you're modeling data, you can actually extend this to a proportional hazards model quite easily, because you've got the scale parameter eta, the PIs add up to 1, the scale parameter. So if you put covariance inside this eta, the intention is that you get the same results as doing a Cox model. Basically, you've got proportional hazards, but with an arbitrarily flexible baseline hazard function. And after the last knot, so we'll assume that the hazard is constant. So you have to decide where that final knot goes if you're modeling data. This slide is as technical as it goes, but I want to explain how you choose these basis functions to get a kind of an optimal fit to the data. So first, you have to choose where to place these knots, so where to partition your axis of time. So it's kind of a conventional practice in spline modeling in general, not just in survival data, that you choose your knots so that you get equal amounts of data in each region of the axis that you're modeling. So you use the quantiles, and in this case, the quantiles of the observed survival times. So the technique that we use is slightly complicated here. We choose a large number of knots, but we control for overfitting by using a specially constructed model, so a hierarchical model on those coefficients pi. So if you read about spline modeling in some other contexts, you might see a description of penalised likelihood methods. So this is a kind of Bayesian analog of these penalised likelihood methods, where we're building a hierarchical model on these coefficients. So you've got these parameters here. I'm actually going to miss out some of the maths, but I'll just try to give the gist of how this works. So you've got the set of pi given this hierarchical distribution. It's actually based on a multinomial logic because the pi's add up to 1. But I won't go into the details of that, but just to say that this hierarchical model is centered around a mean function, which is given by the constant hazard. So that's prior. It's like your prior expectation is that the hazard is constant, but the data can tell you how far you should be departing from that prior mean. And that extent of departure is governed by this variance parameter, which tells you how wiggly your hazard curve is. So this variance parameter defines the smoothness of the hazard function. So if the variance is 0, then you're certain that your hazard is constant, and these coefficients take their prior mean, which is these special values here. The green line are these coefficients that give you a constant hazard. Okay, so we give this variance parameter a prior, and we update that to a posterior. In our Bayesian inference, we update that to a posterior given the data. So the principle behind that is to learn from the data how much smoothness is needed to represent that data, and if you've got weak data, to make a conservative assumption that the hazard is constant. So that's the gist of how it works. But all the details are explained in the paper to read. I should check I'm not wittering on too much. It's half past 1. We're about halfway through the material here. So I should have time for questions if anyone wants to go into more detail about any aspect of this. Right, so I've explained how this single short-term data set is modeled here. And I'll explain next how to build in longer-term sources of information to enable you to extrapolate more confidently based on evidence. Okay, so use of external data. So the model is fairly general in that it will allow any number of external data sources. But each of these specific data sources has to be expressed as a count, as an aggregate count of survivors over a specific time interval. So in this example, you've got 3 external data sources on 3 years of time. They don't have to be years. It could be overlapping or any length of time. So in this first one, we've got 358 people who are alive at 5 years, and out of those people alive, how many are still alive 1 year later? And you can have covariance describing each data source, and that will allow you to relate different data sources to each other and describe them by any variations in treatments or individual characteristics. And I do it like this because it turns out that many sources of data that are useful for survival extrapolation, at least in the kind of health economic evaluation world, can be expressed in this form, because you've got disease registries, you have population mortality statistics that are published as kind of survival probabilities or counts over specific intervals of time. And I'll show you later in a few minutes how you can express elicited judgments in this form too. So in mathematical terms, each of these counts gets modelled as a binomial with a probability, and that probability comes from the spline model that I've already told you about. So we can describe the differences between data sets by putting covariates on the parameters in that model. And what we'll get is a joint posterior that will describe survival for different combinations of covariates. But then if you're making a decision, you have to judge which of those covariate values corresponds to your decision context of interest. And I'll just emphasize at this stage that the external data sets don't necessarily have to describe an identical population to the data sets in the trial. The simplest thing you can do to model any biases or differences is to have basically a data set covariate. And if the data sets describe the same period of time as each other, then you can estimate the hazard ratio for one data set compared to another from that period of time where both data sets were observed. But of course, you have to, and that'll make the assumption that the shape of the hazard is shared. But in order to get any information out of external data at all, you have to make some kinds of assumptions that there is something in common. And the shape being common is a weaker assumption than the actual absolute value of the risk being identical. But of course, you have to take care, especially when you're extrapolating outside the times when the parameters were estimated from. You're making some assumptions that parameters inferred from one time period are kind of generalizable to longer periods. But the package gives us a tool to do this working. So I'll give you some illustrations about how survival extrapolation is achieved using external data. So this is where we left off earlier, where we had a massive uncertainty because there was no data beyond the data that you observed in the trial that only went up to 5 years. So your posterior that's massively inflated. So we want to build in an external data source. We want to not necessarily assume that the hazard is going to be the same as it was in 20 years as it was 5 years. So we add this not. So we add in a registry data on the patients of interest. So in this example, we make the assumption that the control group of the trial had the same risks as the people in the disease registry. And I think it's a reasonable assumption because the hazard levels of the hazard are somewhat similar at this 5-year point where the external data starts. So we've got annual survival data. This is the actual raw data, like the raw hazard estimate from the external data going up to 25 years. So if we put this data in this count form and put it in the Bayesian model, we get a posterior interface age external, give a name to our external data set. And so we get a posterior, which is the dark purple band, which is much more confident because you're combining the information from the trial data in the short term with the registry data in the long term. Under the assumption that the hazard trajectory for those patients is the same as the control group in the trial. But as I said, that's not a strictly necessary assumption, depending on what data you've got. Yes?
In that case, if we had the trial data and we were in one arm, let's say it was the active arm of the trial, How would that correspond with registry data? Would one then have to find in the registry in individuals who had been treated with the treatment?
Well, if it's a novel treatment, then you, I think in general, you're not going to have information about the relative effect of a new treatment. But if you have a standard of care, then I think often you can make assumptions about kind of control groups. But you would have to make other assumptions, such as I'll talk about it in a bit. But you probably would want to do sensitivity analysis to the relative effect of the new treatment in those cases where you don't have that data on a new treatment. So that's one kind of data that you might use. Another kind of data you might use is population data, and I'll give you an example of this. So now suppose we want to extrapolate even further into the future, say up to 40 years. So we add some more knots, 30 and 40 years to represent our belief that the hazard might carry on varying, but we haven't. I guess we don't have any data. It's going to be what it did before, and the posterior will kind of fan out. So
hey there, Johnny. How you doing?
We're building in here a data set on national mortality statistics, and a common thing that you want to do is to make an assumption that the hazard for people with a disease is no less than the general population. So we build in this kind of additive hazard framework. So our background, we assume that is known exactly because we've got full population data, but we've got an excess hazard which we infer from the trial data and the registry data, the data on people with a disease. So you've got this additive hazard structure. So this is making an assumption the hazard people with a trial is greater, but not less than the background. And we play, and the spline model goes on this excess in this case. So it's maybe easier to understand with a picture. So this is the hazard function. The green line here is the population hazard. The hazard for the people with the disease is greater. I'll stick the observed data here and the posterior. So this model will constrain. So if you put this into this additive hazard model, it's going to constrain the fitted hazard under this extrapolation to be kind of greater than the population in the long term. It's never going to get less because you've made this additive hazard something, but it's still kind of quite uncertain in the long term. Quite a wide credible limit at 30 to 40 years. Of course, that might not matter in practice, but in some kind of context, we might want to build in even more data to get a more confident extrapolation. And I'll explain now another kind of data or information we could use is expert judgments or elicited beliefs or judgments based on expertise. So, for example, suppose we were to judge that by 40 years, so this is our latest extrapolation point. Suppose that we were to judge that the people with the disease get cured, so that after the people, these survivors from the disease will no longer have any risk of dying from the disease, and their hazard will become the same as the population. So we might look at our mortality statistics database and get 0.72. So we'd have an elicited belief that has a mean, that mean, and have some kind of credible interval that represents how confident we are about this judgment, or how confident the expert is. So it turns out that you can convert this kind of elicited belief into a convenient count form. So you can just put it in the model as another external data source. And that comes from a simple Bayesian principles, is that it turns out that the posterior you would get with count data of 700 out of 1,000 people having survived, that's equivalent to this kind of elicited belief or a survival probability of 70% with a certain length of credible interval. So the width of that interval is related to this denominator, this 1,000. So if it was 10,000, then the interval would get narrow. If it was 10, then it would get very uncertain. So this is just from the beta and the binomial kind of basic Bayesian statistics. And once we've got this count, we can put it in the model as an additional external data source, just to illustrate the results. And in this slightly artificial example about what happens when we do that, this is our elicited belief here. But the posterior here is the purple line still. That's become more confident. It's been anchored on this elicited belief, and it's become a lot narrower than it was when we just had the population mortality data. So we've just built in the interface, we've just add an extra row to our external data. So the interface is fairly simple. Okay, let's see how much time. Okay, I've got some time to explain about mixture QR models now. So this is another common modeling technique in this kind of survival extrapolation world. So it's common to extrapolate, as I said, by assuming that the disease-specific hazard goes to zero, and that's saying that these people are cured in some sense. So this is often represented using this parametric model, in which you can conceive of a mixture of populations. So a certain proportion of them P get cured, and the other proportion are uncured, and you have an uncured hazard function, which is defined by some parametric survival model. In this case, we've got our flexible spline model we could use for that. So that's effectively saying that the disease-specific hazard will decrease to zero over time. But it's done through this kind of parametric model form. So let's just think about, would that be sensible in this example? So suppose we just had our registry data, our trial data, and this is our population data. I don't think there's very much evidence from that data that the hazard is converging towards the population hazard. I mean, maybe a little bit, but it's pretty weak. So if you were to use that model on the basis of that data alone, I don't think that would be very, very kind of grounded in the data. But I mean, if you went ahead and fitted it to the model in any case, I mean, you could estimate this decrease. I think it's being inferred from the slight decrease, but the result here is going to be strongly influenced by this kind of parametric form, this kind of mixture form. So it's not really, this extrapolation here is not really based on, I wouldn't say this is really based on the data. It's based very strongly on this kind of abstract assumption that there's probably going to be a cure at some point, but we don't know when that is. We're just going to use this kind of conventional parametric shape. So you can do that in the package, but I think it's not always going to be sensible. And I think that if you want to make judgments about cure, then I think it's much more transparent and clear to express those assumptions using kind of directly elicited judgments. So like we did before, so you might state by 40 years, we think that survival of the disease patients are going to be similar to the general population. I think whether or not that's a good assumption, or I think it's a lot clearer than basing this pure extrapolation on this slightly opaque parametric model form. And we've got the tools of the package to implement this kind of elicited data technique more easily. Okay, we got now. So I haven't talked too much about treatments or covariate effects. So like I said, you can fit proportional hazards models. So I'll just remind you of how that works. Clicking back here. So this is your hazard function So this scale parameter eta becomes e to the beta x. It becomes a proportional hazards model. So if you fit that model to your data, you will get the same results as a Cox model, by and large, because you've got a flexible baseline. And flick back. Sorry about all this flicking, but I wanted to explain how you relax the proportional hazard assumption. And that's essentially by expressing these extra parameters, these shape parameters pi, as functions of covariance too. And there is a slightly involved model for doing that, involving a kind of hierarchical shrinkage thing. But the idea behind the package is that you can estimate the extent of non-proportionality you need from the data itself. Forwards. And there's a simple interface for doing that, but you can assume that either all of the covariates have non-proportional hazards or just some of the covariates, and you can put a formula object in this too, in this non-prop thing too, if you're familiar with our syntax. So another thing, this is related to Gilbert's question earlier about what you do with treatments in kind of health technology assessment situation. I mean, for a novel treatment, you generally not going to have any information at all about how that treatment performs beyond the horizon of the trial, because the trial is typically going to be based on the standard of care. But there's an interface in the package for doing sensitivity analysis to this long-term treatment effects, and it's implemented by imposing a kind of arbitrarily decreasing treatment effect when predicting in the long term. So you could assume decreases from the modeled value at one time down to zero at some arbitrary time that you specify but you won't be able to learn the shape of that decrease from data usually. It's just a tool for doing sensitivity analysis for different plausible assumptions about is there a waning effect? Does the treatment effect carry on forever? Does the treatment effect just stop instantly after the trial ends? And how much does that affect the decision that you make about the kind of long-term cost effectiveness or whatever the decision is going to be based on? Okay. Oh, here's a final kind of interesting technical point about priors. So I know many people are skeptical about Bayesian methods, and I can understand that because they are more complicated and they depend on more what we call moving parts, I suppose. There's more things that the analyst can choose, and that's the prior. And I think it's worth giving people tools and methods for choosing priors that are sensible. But it's challenging. But one very useful tool you can use, a kind of magic trick for assessing whether a prior is sensible, is by using simulation. So in these models, they're complicated. They've got parameters that are slightly strange and don't make directly applied sense. So flick back again. We had this hierarchical model on the basis coefficients, and it's determined by this parameter sigma that describes how wiggly the hazard is. So sigma equals 0, and bigger sigma, more wiggly. But what does sigma equals 1 mean? What does sigma equals 2 mean? How can you interpret that to choose a prior? Well, you can't. I mean, the fact that this parameter doesn't have a direct quantitative interpretation, but what you can do is you can simulate from the model. And something that you can interpret is a hazard or absolute or relative risk. And so if you simulate, you can simulate from the model, you can get different hazard curves for different parameters. So if we do that once, we simulate one hazard curve from our prior, and simulate 2 hazard curves, simulate 3 hazard curves. They will look different, but they will have you can summarize them according to things that you think are interesting about those hazards curves. So for the wiggliness, we want to know how much wiggliness do we expect, and one way you can express that is the difference between highest values and the lowest values, how much overall variability is there in hazards. If it's constant hazard, then this variability will be 0. So if you simulate your prior, you get a distribution for these high versus low values and how much variability. So you can say, how much variability do we expect? So you can specify beliefs such as, the highest hazards are unlikely to be 10 times the lowest values. So you could say the 5% chance that the highest values are 10 times the lowest values. So there's a tool in the package for converting the default priors that you specify to the implications of those defaults. So you can look at different priors and see what that tells you about your hazards and relative hazard and things that have an easier interpretation. So that's just one example. I mean, there are other parameters of the model that you can use different, similar kinds of tricks to choose whether they're sensible. Okay, so I'm coming to the end now. There's a lot of details that I haven't mentioned, but there's a full info in the paper. There's full documentation and worked examples on this website, and there's a reference manual and different kind of case studies, including the case study in the paper, with kind of fully reproducible thingy in the paper. There's lots of details I haven't mentioned. One thing is that you can produce outputs in neat and tidy formats. A common output that people are interested in is the restricted mean survival over a specific time period. You get posterior summaries of this and other things. And another very useful tool is to compare different models, say with different priors or different spline specifications, and use a Bayesian cross-validation procedure to tell you overall, does this represent my data well, and you can compare, does this make a difference to the results? So the software is on GitHub at the moment. It's not yet on CRAN. When we've done a bit more work on assessing whether the defaults are sensible, it's going to be put on CRAN. So at the moment, we're doing simulation studies to assess whether the defaults are sensible, because a lot of users and packages, they're just not going to think about what the priors and what the spline settings are. They're just going to use what's in the package. So ideally, those defaults are going to be sensible in a wide range of kind of realistic situations. And also, I end by saying that this is novel statistical methodology, and it's complicated, and people don't like using new complicated things. But I like to understand why and what exactly is it about specific methods. What is it that's how can we break down this barrier to entry to complex methods? I mean, I was just thinking this one in Cox models, for example. I mean, how many people really understand what the partial likelihood in a Cox model is and where that comes from? But it just gets used because that's a standard method. But but novel methods, they get into practice somehow by being shown to be useful and being understandable enough. So I want to listen to users and find out what those barriers are, and hopefully get more principled methods, make those usable in practice. So on that note, I'll finish. So thanks for your attention.
That was a good course of this area. I'm interested in the thinking again of trials, because and thinking of NICE and thinking of the economic evaluations that they do. I mean, I'm not privy to that. I'm not sat on an economic evaluation panel. But one wonders how many years ahead they like to think about the benefits. I mean, with your software they can have any number, they can clearly put any number of knots in, but they must have in their mindset a kind of standard number of years where the benefit, how many years before the return on the investment is sensible in terms of follies or in terms of economic return using some measure. So I was wondering if you were aware of that in their thinking. Is there some standard measures they could exploit this software easily with?
Well, yeah, this is the point with the software. Embed it into conventional ways that things are done, and I've never worked directly on nice appraisals. I mean, I have a slightly casual understanding, I have to admit, on how things are done. I think the starting point, for chronic diseases is lifetime survival, but often they make judgments that about after such a length of time, any differences are going to be negligible. But I mean, the software, you have to say explicitly how far you want to extrapolate up to, and that's the intention, is to get people to think. They have to think about what number they're putting in there. So hopefully, that will kind of encourage the use of that tool to be based on something on some thoughtful considerations.
How long did it take you to write this?
Well, I'm still writing it in a sense. I mean, there's about a month of full-time work to get a prototype, but then beyond then, it was adding polishing and my part-time. Well, I don't know. I have to look at my timesheets for the year that was meticulously recorded. Answer a question that has popped up in the chat. So,
sorry, that was a question that I added there, Chris. Sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
This is just fantastic because I literally, you think about all of these assumptions, in the clinical trials and long term and cure effects and all this stuff. It's just fantastic. So yeah, I mean, I probably have a lot of questions, but one of them was just on is it slide 10? I was just going through slide 10. You just highlighted the sum of the PI, obviously in the formula, and then there was 3 different examples that you gave.
Oh, was the error? This is a hard constraint. So if it's not 0, 2, 5. Oh, something weird's gone with that.
Oh,
so maybe they're not.
Don't understand.
Maybe they should have been normalized or something, but that's.
Yeah, because the other ones, it's like, see, okay, so it's nothing funny. It's just, it should add up to 1.
Spotting that A looks dodgy to me. That shouldn't be a 20. I suspect they should have been.
Oh no, it's okay. I thought I was just missing something.
Yeah.
No, thanks. Sorry, I thought I was just missing something there. I couldn't get that.
Yeah.
But no, thanks. I think Leah's got a question as well. Go ahead, sorry.
Hiya. I'd heard you talk about this before, but it's really interesting to hear it in more statistical detail. I was kind of wondering, in terms of the basis. So this is a hazards model. Have you just done it in terms of proportional hazards with the ability to relax, or is there any kind of option for accelerated failure time or any kind of other basis?
No, I mean, this seems to be the one that kind of worked the best in terms of the maths being clean. And that, the proportional hazards model, people understand that because they're familiar with Cox models, and you can have a non-proportional hazards model, which I haven't talked about much, but essentially just let the P's depend on covariates too, and then you can get as flexible a model as you like for covariate effects. But essentially, these are just many models are just arbitrary. I mean, I wouldn't really see any benefit in having an explicit accelerated failure time model. It's just kind of a tool to get a model that fits the data well, and I don't really understand them that well. Accelerated failure time, but intention is to describe the data.
Yeah. I had kind of a follow-up question, which is, if I work in HTA, and we would often see the I don't really know why this has come about, because my original background is statistics, but when we see models submitted to us, they're normally just analysed separately by treatment arm. Whereas for this, like, because all your data is probably your external or your long-term data is probably going to be on the standard of care. Because obviously, if it's a new treatment, you don't have the long-term information. Like, it'd be interesting to see how that, when this is used, how that kind of could put more focus on, like, being explicit about those long-term assumptions about, like, things like we're often thinking, like, because I work for the NTP, so it's like nice but Irish. We're often thinking about things like treatment waning and the duration of effect and things like that. So it would be interesting to see if, there's just more, it's more explicit around the assumptions you're making there.
That's certainly the intention, and I hope it's. If it doesn't make sense, then I think there's something wrong to tackle if it's not explicit. But there's a lot of kind of black box hidden assumptions, and that's the kind of ongoing work we're doing, is to try and show that those assumptions don't really matter, and you get sensible results in a range of cases. I answered the question from Bobby in the chat. How does one consider adding external data to a model that uses covariates? So the covariate has to be constant for all members of that external data, I guess, is the answer to that. You'd have to be able to stratify somehow your data sets so that each count has a common covariate value. It could be age group or sex or a risk strata or something like that. Is that
okay? That answers. So you don't need to stratify by all key parameters you're interested in. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I thought about the last bit, how you check the importance of the priors. Have you incorporated in this package a way that one can automatically do that somehow? Because, for people who are not Bayesian and don't know quite, these simulations, can they be pre-specified in a way that you have set of checks to do?
No, not at the moment. Let me just flick back to that slide. Currently, it's a kind of a process of trial and error, I suppose. So there's a default, and the current kind of recommended way of using the package is to simulate from the default, see if it makes sense, and if it doesn't make sense, tweak it somehow, and then untweak it until it does make sense. And it is actually quite a complex area in that I don't know if there's not always kind of a unique prior which fits a specific kind of belief best. But the best we can do is just check what we've put in and see if it makes sense. But you've raised an important point. There's a lot that is unsolved kind of in the theory behind how to construct priors for complex models like this.
So there's no way that there's no informative prior in a way. One cannot pre-specify those in particular situations.
But sometimes you can just change. So if you've got I'll give an example. So there's the default prior on sigma is gamma with a certain shape and scale. So if that looks to not fit your beliefs well, then you would change the scale to something more tighter or something looser until you get and then each time you tweak it, you do another simulation and see if it makes it tighter on the interpretable scale.
Thank you, Chris. I should say that your work is great. It's a great contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Serve somebody, then you're interested in looking long term. So then, there's information coming in from other sources, potentially how different age groups could potentially change in their survival through time in the longer term. But how does your coding actually handle the fact that you've got different the data necessarily now from a trial is very much on that short-term scale, but then age of interest. So the slide that's extra covariance.
Yeah, so I mean, partially it's setting up your data in a way that is matchable. So if you're getting external data, you would have to try and from a population mortality statistics, you would have to get data that represent that are similar to the people in your trial. Then you've got the effect of starting age, time since starting age. So like achieved age, I suppose, is starting age plus time. So if you can, so if the starting age, if you think that the starting age has an effect on the outcome other than just the how long people have been followed up, then I guess that should be a covariance, something that you stratify on somehow. But yeah, there's
into the details.
Yeah. Yeah, it's partially working out what people want to use it for, because different applications might look different in what kinds of age-specific data they're dealing with and what kinds of populations they're trying to match. I guess the example in the paper is where you had one data set was representative of the other data set to some extent, and they were kind of data sets were pre-processed. So, but I think as long as you're able to stratify your counts to represent how you think the risk varies in different strata, I think you should be able to do what you want. But if you've got a specific example in mind, then I think it would be helpful to post it on the GitHub issues. So if you've got suggestions for specific situations that you want the package to be document how to do well, and it'd be good to get kind of worked examples for how exactly to achieve that. So I'm very up for adding more documentation and things like that.
Can I squeeze a question?
Hi.
So, hello. So you know that we health economists, we usually also model events before death. So one extension could be like an event that has happened during follow-up, but before that, and how the treatment impacts both the event and then the impact on mortality. And that's not probably too difficult in the proportional hazard context. So it could be a covariate, for example, or something. I'm just flagging that will be quite of interest.
That's reminding me of the idea of multi-states models, which that's how I would tend to think of that kind of situation where you've got events other than death, and then you would have another survival model, and it gets